We turn today to 1 Timothy and chapter 5 and verse 11. We were considering last week the requirements that Paul laid down for taking widows onto the support list of the church. This was one of the ministries that the early church engaged in. It was a ministry of compassion and of help of those deserving financial help in particular. Widows and orphans were the particular care of the early Christians. James says in James chapter 1 in the last verse that pure religion and undefiled before God the Father is to visit the widows and the orphans in their distress. But Paul lays down here certain safeguards to prevent this type of service being abused. There is always the danger, whenever a church begins to engage in any type of social work and of helping those who are in financial difficulty, of people taking advantage of this. This danger is prevalent even today. One needs great wisdom in the exercise of the ministry of helping people financially. We read even in the early church in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1 that the first dispute and quarrel that came among the early Christians, who were, generally speaking, one in heart and soul and mind, related to the distribution of food among the widows. That was a good ministry, to distribute food to the widows who were in need, but among them there came murmuring concerning unequal distribution. And so here we see is an area where we do need to help those who are in distress. But yet at the same time, we need to exercise great wisdom. And so the apostle said in Acts chapter 6 that they themselves could not devote themselves to this task, being called to prayer and to the ministry of the word. For they said, select among you 7 men of good reputation, Acts 6:3, full of the Spirit, and also, particularly, they said, of wisdom. This is the great need in this area. Not only the fullness of the Spirit, but wisdom concerning how to carry on this ministry. And Paul, through the years of experience, has acquired some wisdom in this matter of assisting widows who are in need. And he lays down these guidelines in 1 Timothy 5 concerning the qualifications, the type of widow that one should take on. Some of these qualifications are listed in verse 10. And verse 11 to 15, he speaks about younger widows not being taken on the list. He has listed 60 years as the age limit, the minimum age for taking on a widow in verse 9. And then he gives the reason why he feels it's not wise to take on younger widows onto the list. In 1 Timothy 5:11, he says they begin to feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ after a little while, because they are young and they may desire to get married again. There's nothing wrong in that. But having initially decided to stay single, then they can go back on their pledge, it says in verse 12. And the result is, in their frustration with these desires burning within them, they learn to be idle, verse 13. They could have worked, but they learn to be idle because they are supported by the church, a danger that faces all people who are supported by the church. The danger of being idle. In the world, one has to work hard to earn one's living. But when one is supported by the church, there is a great danger of being idle. And not only idle, it says they go around from house to house and become gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Repeatedly in Timothy, Paul says that women are particularly in danger of using their tongue in an uncontrolled way, in gossiping, in being a busybody in other people's matters, in dealing with things which don't concern them in any way, and particularly the younger sisters. And the younger widows here are in this danger because they're being supported by the church and they find the whole day with time on their hands and nothing to do. They begin to visit, initially perhaps with a good motive of reaching people with the gospel or encouraging other believers, but it ends up with visiting from house to house, being merely a gossip and a busybody, and talking about things which are unfit to be mentioned by the saints. In verse 14 he says, "Therefore, my advice is that the younger widows should get married." This is not a command, but Paul says that this is his advice and this is what he thinks is best. "And bear children. This will save them from being idle." And this is the primary ministry that God is committed to a woman, as we already saw in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. And it's one of the means by which younger sisters particularly are kept from all these evil habits that the devil can lead them into because they are idle. If they have children to look after, that keeps them occupied from morning till night, and in a good way. And they can acquire patience and many other of the virtues of Christ in the different situations they find in their home in bringing up children. And so it says, let them get married and bear children and keep house. This is another ministry which a woman is particularly called to look after the home. This is another thing. If she takes it seriously, she'll find much of her time is occupied with this, and therefore she is saved from idle gossiping and visiting from house to house and wasting their time and other people's time. And if a younger widow does this, get married, bear children, and keep house, then she protects herself from giving the enemy occasion for reproach on her behalf. Satan is just waiting for an opportunity to speak against God's children and the saints. We must give no occasion for Satan to bring any reproach on the saints. And so, this is not only an exhortation for widows, but for all younger sisters and for all of us in general, not to give the enemy an occasion for reproach. And he says further, in verse 15, from his own experience, obviously he's observed through the years that some have already turned aside to follow Satan. Now, these were people who were originally believers. He's not talking about unbelievers here. He's talking about believers, younger widows who had faith in Christ and who trusted the Lord and initially were disciples, wanted to follow the Lord, but they've turned aside and begun to follow Satan. Now, this verse clearly indicates that it's possible for a person to begin to follow the Lord and after a time to backslide and begin to go the opposite direction, to follow Satan. It's not just an occasional yielding into temptation, but a deliberate following of Satan. Just like a disciple of Christ follows Jesus, here are people who have turned aside so far that they've turned aside to follow Satan. Now, there are many warnings for younger sisters here and for all of us in general, that if we don't keep ourselves occupied in healthy pursuits that God has appointed for us, it's easy to turn aside from the faith and follow Satan. And then in conclusion, in verse 16, Paul speaks again about those who are believers who have dependent widows. He says, if any woman is a believer, has dependent widows, supposing you are a sister and you have a widow whom you are related to in some way closely and whom you could support because you yourself are earning, it says, let her assist them. If there are widows who are dependent on you, don't let the church be burdened, it says, because the church does not have unlimited resources, and so the church can assist those who are widows indeed. And so in this whole section, we find Paul exhorting Timothy to be very careful in the use of the church's finances in any type of social work. And this is an exhortation that we need very much in these days too. It is true that the Christian church needs to engage in helping those who are poor, particularly among the household of faith. We are told very clearly in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 that we are to do good to all men, especially to those who are the household of faith. And that doing good in its context there refers to financial help particularly. And we are to provide this help for all who are in financial need, especially within the church. But there's a great need for exercising wisdom, and that we don't use the funds of the church in an unlimited, careless way. There's a great need for faithfulness and carefulness and wisdom in the use of the church's finances. Jesus spoke about the faithful and wise steward. In exercising this ministry of using the church's finances to help the poor, The two great needs are for faithfulness and for wisdom, to consider that money as one's own and not to use it unwisely. And if there are other people who can take care of these widows, then one should not hesitate to speak to them and say that it is their responsibility to look after their relatives. The New Testament speaks very clearly in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8 and also in verse 16 that it is the responsibility of people to look after their own household and their relatives. If they don't do that, they have denied the faith and come to a level worse than that of an unbeliever. And so let's take this exhortation seriously. In the handling of the church's finances, let's learn to do good to the household of faith, but be faithful and wise.